So it is my pleasure today to introduce our guest to the Move Smartly podcast and YouTube program. Mike Moffat is the Senior Director of Policy and Innovation at the Smart Prosperity Institute and an Assistant Professor in Business Economics and Public Policy at the Ivey Business School at Western University. Mike's research focuses on the intersection between regional economic development, building child-friendly, climate-friendly housing and communities, and clean innovation. Mike has worked with politicians and policymakers of all stripes. He recently served, I believe, from 2013 to 2015 as the economic advisor to Liberal leader, now Prime Minister Justin Trudeau. And Mike holds a PhD in management science from Ivey Business School and an MA in economics from the University of Rochester. Welcome, Mike.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for having me.
Yes, that lovely point where you have to get through a long intro, but I really wanted our audience to know all about your focuses. And I understand from your Twitter that you're now taking on another role.
Yeah, so
to add to your already busy life.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's a new initiative that we're launching at the Smart Prosperity Institute called the Place Center. And basically, what we're looking at is issues from a local lens. So the Smart Prosperity Institute looks at any issues that has the environment and the economy going together. So big things like carbon pricing and labor market policy and a lot of larger housing market policies as well. But we're going to take at the Place Center, we're taking more of a local approach because we recognize that the challenges that Windsor, Ontario has are just fundamentally different than the challenges that Windsor, Nova Scotia faces. So by using that local lens, we can work with groups on the ground to create those family-friendly, climate-friendly communities that we all want, and recognizing that, again, that's going to look a whole lot different in Toronto than it may look in rural Manitoba.
Great. So that actually leads us nicely to my first question. A lot of words are being written about the housing problem, not only here in Canada, but in the US and around the world. But it seems to me that this issue has one heck of a definition of the problem. The housing problem seems to mean so many different things. So there's unaffordable homes, unaffordable rents, homelessness, unsuitable housing, poorly designed housing, environmental impacts, social impacts, and so on. So what does the housing problem mean to you?
Well, I think it's all of the above, and you're absolutely right that it's a whole sort of ball of problems. Because first of all, there's no one housing market, right? Like housing's all sort of location, but on top of that, there's sort of different classes of housing, different needs. So a couple of seniors and probably need something different than a young family, and so on. So you have all of these markets, but they're all interconnected with each other at some level as well. But they all tie into these larger societal issues. So if you have a market, let's say parts of Toronto, for instance, that have gotten really expensive, that have priced out the middle class, then that's going to affect your labor market because you're not going to be able to have nurses and teachers and construction workers be able to afford it to live in your city. So because of that, yeah, it's a whole mess of problems. It's a massive system. And we need to look at things from, on the one side of the spectrum, homelessness, to the other side of the spectrum of, I'm well housed, but my 25-year-old who's living in my basement can't afford to move out on their own, and kind of everything in between. So there's so many different issues out there that it makes for a complicated discussion, and it feels like any discussion is kind of just scratching the surface a little bit. So there's a lot to work on. As somebody who does housing work, I could also consider it a form of job security. We're never going to kind of run out of things to be thinking about, but yeah, it's a whole bunch of issues all tied into one.
Yeah. I mean, some might say you were well housed until your 25-year-old son moved into your basement. But it's a point well taken. Along with the problem definition, I find the solutions, because leading from the problem definition the solutions are equally varied and, dare I say, often very nebulous. You've recently described the mission for your work as being clean and resilient growth and livable and sustainable communities in communities across Canada. So I wonder if you could give us a more concrete example of what that might look like to you.
Well, absolutely, and it's why we need nuance in the housing discussion. So, part of the housing discussion is about just, looking at housing shortages, the sort of number of units, and we've done research on that. And I tend to be one of the ones who gets cited the most in the Ontario discussion around, Ontario's need for 1.5 million housing units over the next decade. But we have to sort of recognize that is just a high level description of needs, that we need to get into these discussions of, okay, well, where are they needed? What types of units are needed at what price point? But then you couple in the fact that we also don't want to get there by, paving over the entire, all of our farmlands and wetlands and so on. We have to sort of recognize that there are these environmental challenges that we need to build these homes. But as well, if we start building homes on wetlands, that's not good for the wetlands, but it's also not good for the homes in the surrounding areas. That does a lot of sort of flood control. And what we find too often in this debate is that we get these polarized sides, where on the one hand, it's just like, people sort of recognize we have a housing crisis, and in a crisis, there's a viewpoint that you can't sort of afford to be too particular. Anything goes, and you just need to sort of solve this thing. And then on the other hand, you get people who care about the environmental side, and I am one of them, but then fall into this trap of, well, then we have to say that the housing crisis is overblown, and we actually don't really need that many homes, and it's all just kind of a bunch of a hoax, and that probably isn't true either. So what we're trying to do is say, okay, we can walk and chew gum at the same time. Like we can build those great communities that we all want, while at the same time leaving parklands and wetlands and farms and so on. Recognize that there are going to be edge cases. There are going to be times where we do have to expand urban growth boundaries. There are going to be trade-offs. But if we understand what we're trying to accomplish and think things through and do some long run planning, we can tie all these pieces together and get outcomes that work for everyone or close to everyone.
And so does your institute hope to partner with governments or builders, or what is the objective of some of this work that you're doing?
Yeah, absolutely, and we do exactly that. We partner with and then sometimes are funded by, first of all, 3 different levels of government. So we've worked with the federal government, we've worked with the provincial government, we've worked with municipalities, worked with organizations of municipalities like the Ontario Big Cities Mayors Caucus. We work with builders, we work with developers, we work with groups like the Canadian Association to End Homelessness. We work with disability rights group. That's, my sort of, my day job is on the sort of clean economy side, but sort of when I take that hat off, nights and weekends, I'm a bit of a disability rights advocate and, work on those kind of files. So we try to bring all of that together because we recognize that all has to be part of the solution, right? That we can work with environmental groups and varieties of government and bring in all of those perspectives. And that's what we're trying to do, trying to build that coalition together where we're not all sort of fighting each other, but we're kind of saying, okay, here's what you want, here's what I want, and here's what we need, and trying to find that sort of center of that Venn diagram of like, what can we find that simultaneously satisfies all of those needs.
Interesting. So you touched on this. You and your colleagues have done a lot of in-depth leading work around trying to quantify how many homes need to be built in Ontario to meet need. So you first started with a very thorough study called Baby Needs a New Home back in 2021, as if that's so long ago, I believe. It was in 2021. So could you take us through how your team set about getting to this number and what the number was? You already mentioned it. So first of all, what need, how did you measure what that need meant? because there's many measures, right? Some people will say you need X to make housing more affordable. Some people will just say you need X to house people that are interested in owning a home. So how did you define the need? How did you get to that number? And again, remind us of the number.
Yeah, so absolutely. So and this numbers change over time. So our first report back in 2021, we basically just tried to convert expected population growth. So basically, what was happening with the number of kids being born, immigration to the province, the number of growth in international students at a very sort of local level, and take those projections of population growth that exist. They already exist from the Ontario Ministry of Finance, and then convert that into housing need, right? Because we know, it's not one person per one house, but the age of the population matters when it comes to housing need. Generational turnover matters. That over time, people age out of their homes, those homes go onto the market, and so on. So we considered all of that, and we said, we're seeing the need over the next 10 years for about just over 1 million homes, and that was the number that came out of that report, and that came out in, I think it was October 2021. And the response we got from that report is 1 million is a huge number. Like you've clearly done something wrong. You've got your thumb on the scale, and it can't possibly be that many. By February of that year, the provincial government had a task force, and they said, no, actually, the number is 1.5 million. So our report at that point seemed a little kind of quaint and out of date. So then we've got this 1.5 number floating around. So we decided at SPI to do a report, and our plan was actually to debunk the number. Go, yeah, 1.5 seems a little large to us, but there were things that our report didn't consider the first time. So we basically, our first report only looked at future housing need, didn't look at pre-existing shortages. So we ignored that issue. And the other thing is that there had been changes to immigration targets and the number of international students that had happened since the October report. So we said, okay, if we take into account pre-existing shortages, and we take into account these issues around increased immigration, increased number of international students, do we get a number that's close to 1.5 million? And so we did a big Excel model, and on our very first try, we got 1.5 million. And I thought we had messed up somewhere. I thought that we had going to put their target in there. Like we had gotten so close to it. So we couldn't believe it. Because we didn't know where they got this 1.5 million number from. It seemed really arbitrary. But then when we crunched the numbers again, we confirmed that, yeah, you know what, this number that we had set out to debunk, we thought this number was false. Turns out they were probably onto something, and it does look like Ontario needs 1.5 million homes in the next 10 years to keep up with population growth and to deal with those pre-existing shortages.
So interesting. So that would average out to 100,000 homes being built a year.
Well, so yeah, the original we were saying we need 100,000, and now it seems to be 150,000, and that's partly to cover that increase in immigration. So that would be about 10,000 a year to cover that, and the remaining 40,000 would be to cover the pre-existing shortages that we've had over the last little while. And then furthermore, then we sort of break it down by geography, recognizing that a lot of those shortages are in the GTA, that actually large parts of Northern Ontario don't need that much more housing, that basically new families are being formed largely at the same rates that others are aging out of their homes, and they're sort of in this nice kind of static equilibrium. Southern Ontario doesn't have that we do have a rapidly growing population, and that creates housing needs.
So I've just memorized your 1.5 million over 10 years needed for Ontario number. And the federal government, I believe last month, has just announced even more ambitious immigration targets. So do you and your team need to go back and recalculate that number?
We might, yes. So I would think overall it shouldn't affect things too much. But you're absolutely right that our immigration targets are going from 400,000 to about 500,000, which is tremendous. So an extra 100,000 people a year. But I think the net effect of that might be a little bit smaller than we think. First of all, only about 40% of that increase would be in Ontario. So really it's 40,000 in Ontario. But we should recognize that a lot of them are already here. That we tend to have this visual in our mind, and it is actually true for many people that an immigrant to Canada is a new arrival to Canada. And that in many cases that's simply not true. The one of the most common immigration pathways in Canada is being an international student. So basically, you come to Canada, you get a college diploma or university degree. You stay in Canada for up to 3 years under the postgraduate work permit program, which allows you to stay in Canada and work in a field related to your degree or diploma, and then apply to permanent residency. So overall, the numbers mean, it is an extra sort of 40, it is, the target in Ontario is about an extra 40,000 people, but many of those 40,000 are already here. So we have to crunch the numbers to find out exactly what that means for housing. But it will need a bit of an increase. So yeah, I think at some point, maybe in early 2023, we're going to have to do a 2023 edition. And that seems to be my life right now, that I think every year we're going to have an annual update because something changes.
Yes, well, immigration targets and notably, and that's perhaps something that needs to be part of your coalition of actors. Is there any chance we can start coordinating some of these different policies?
Yeah, I think we need to. Yeah, I absolutely think we need to. That we do these things in silos, right? That we have our immigration policies on the one hand, and then our housing market policies on the other hand. They don't talk to each other. They don't interact with each other, and that's kind of the challenge that Ontario had before the pandemic. And we had a whole paper on this that we did with the with Build, the Toronto Home Builders Association, called Forecast for Failure. And what happened was back in 2016 that the federal government had started to increase immigration targets, and even going back to 2014, they had liberalized the rules for international students. But none of those changes filtered into the provincial growth planning for the GTA. Like if you read the growth plans of 2016 and 2017, they don't even acknowledge these changes. They were almost unaware of them. So these policies didn't talk to each other. So absolutely, we need to have that coordination. And if we do this right, that immigration policy can help us address the housing needs. Policy through skilled labor, through bringing in more tradespeople. This is something here in Ontario. Labor Minister McNaughton has talked about quite a lot, about increasing the number of skilled trades who come to the province. So that way we have that cohort of electricians, the sheet metal workers and roofers to build the housing that we need. So immigration can actually be the solution to the housing challenge, and not just a need to build more houses.
Interesting, given your experience, that you are affirming what it seems like from the outside, that everybody is siloed on this very important issue, which is unfortunate, and hopefully something can change. So I want to talk a little bit more about broadening out this the issue of housing and supply. For many years, the shortage of housing has been the dominant narrative cited by many when it comes to the GTA's housing affordability issues, and primarily by industry. You mentioned your work with home builders and many others. The slogan seemed to be, it's supply stupid. And I'm now starting to see a lot of journalists and academics, both here in Canada, starting to coalesce around this idea of supply skepticism. The idea that people feel that the more you build, the more expensive housing will get. This runs counter to what we normally think in traditional economics. You increase supply, you should decrease price. And this but this seems to be not happening in the housing sector. People get a sense that the more you build, the pricier things will be. You see a condo go up in your neighborhood and it makes you kind of nervous. So this feeling is being blamed, blame is the word, for us not building enough homes as a society. But, and I hope you'll indulge me for a second, particularly because of your focus on localism, I think it's hard to blame people for feeling this way. In my own experience, I was born in Scarborough, Ontario, so then a suburb, now part of the city of Toronto. I lived in a semi-detached, in a neighborhood of semi-detaches. My neighbor could talk to me from her bedroom window when my sister and I, were playing in our own backyard. We could see our primary school from the front window, our local high school from the back. So a pretty dense, relative for Toronto, dense neighborhood. My parents finally achieved the dream. They get a detached, bigger home in the suburb, in Richmond Hill, in York Region, just north of Toronto. And when I started high school there, our newspaper was called the Cornfield Chronicle. So we were surrounded by fields, very different from where I grew up. Now, when I visit my parents in Richmond Hill, every single field I remember from my youth is covered in homes as far as the eye can see. Then I start a university at the University of Toronto, downtown on St. George campus. And this was in the late 90s. When we started graduating, there were only a certain number of neighborhoods that were viable options for young professionals, still not with a lot of money. Today, that number has increased, I'd say tenfold, maybe more. There's entire communities, City Place, Liberty Village, Leslieville, where I live, that were not even in play. And even now, when I look outside towards the CN Tower from the East End, I see tons of cranes, and I can't even count the number of buildings that are under construction. So we have built some homes. So what has happened, and why won't building more homes just lead to more of the same affordability and other problems?
Yeah, so I think there's three things there and you know, I can understand why people feel that way, and there's some truth to it, right? Like in anything, you know, there's always these kind of grains of truth to it. So, but I think there are three things. That one, I think we underestimate how much we built in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, right? That yes, we are building a lot right now. But even actually, historically speaking, we're actually not building all that much right now. But what happened was in the late 90s and early 2000s, we didn't build very much. So, you know, have you ever gone outside on a spring day and it's been winter a while and it's like 8 degrees and it feels really warm? That's kind of what's going on with a home building. It's just like we had a home building winter for like 20 years, and now some are starting to get built. And we're like, oh, look at all these homes. But historically speaking, it hasn't been all that many. So I think that's one thing to keep in mind. The other thing to keep in mind is that the prices can go up at a hyper local level. You're absolutely right that you can have building in a specific neighborhood that does gentrify that neighborhood, that actually does cause that neighborhood to be more expensive, that that overall, while it might sort of across the city or across the region help depress prices in any one neighborhood can go up and can go down by the amount of building. But I think the thing that causes people to make this false association is this drawing the wrong conclusion from the correlation, right? That I used to have a friend who liked to say that you know, he didn't go to the doctor because you know, you go to the doctor's for sick people, so yeah, I don't want to be sick, so I'm not going to go to the doctor, right? It's drawing the sort of wrong conclusion from that, going that like going to the doctor makes you sick because sick people go to the doctor, right? So it's this kind of same thing where you know, yes, the places where a lot of building is happening tend to be places that are getting more expensive, but they're not getting more expensive because the building's happening. The building's happening because the places are getting more expensive because they're getting a lot more population growth. And if you didn't, if you didn't have that building, that'd be even more expensive. And if you didn't go to the doctor, you'd be getting even sicker. So it's that sort of, people, we think in terms of correlations, right? We tend to see, okay, A and B are happening at the same time, therefore A is causing B. My city's getting expensive at the same time that we're building a lot, therefore the building is causing us to get it expensive. But really what's happening is that the city is prospering, which is both causing more homes to be built and causing the city to be more expensive at the same time.
Yes, I mean, and feeling is so complicated. There's so many ways to look at this. On the one hand, if excess building is not excess, new buildings are coming into your neighborhood and it becomes more popular, that might attract more and more demand. At the same time, you have homeowners worried that that will affect the prices of their homes and make them lower because the new buildings are condos. So there's a lot of intuitive thinking. Do you see that as one of the biggest barriers when it comes to discussing housing?
Yeah, I do see it as a challenge, because you're absolutely right. Because I do get that argument from both sides, right? Where it's like, oh, we can't build more, because if we build more in our neighborhood, that's gonna drive up price. But also like, oh, if we build more in the neighborhood, that's gonna lower our prices, and homeowners don't want to see their equity fade away. So then it's like, okay, well, what is this Goldilocks amount of building that's neither too hot or too cold? So that is an issue. And I think one of the things that I think there's two ways that we can approach that issue, because I do think it does cause a certain level of NIMBYism, or a certain level of concern. I think that the first thing is to take, to try and play on empathy, sort of realize that young people need new houses, and this is how things were when you were starting out, and we need to be able to give the advantages to the next generation. But the other thing we do is play to selfishness, in the sense that we need these new houses so you can get that 25-year-old out of your basement, or try to actually change the types of housing we're building in existing neighborhoods. I think one of the most valuable things we can do, and we see this in some neighborhoods, is if we can build seniors friendly housing in those neighborhoods. And that what the sort of unique selling proposition is that we're trying to allow existing residents of the neighborhood who want to stay in the neighborhood but are feeling kind of overhoused. It allows them to downsize, move into something more appropriate, and for them cheaper as well, so they can actually profit off of the big capital gain that they've had over the last 30 to 40 years. And then that unlocks the existing homes to another generation. So I think there are two ways to approach this, and I think both can be useful. Like one playing to empathy, but the second one playing to pure selfishness, going, no, we need to build more in your community, so your son or daughter, it doesn't have to live with you forever. And oh, by the way, you can move into this house and sell your place for 1.8 million, buy this place for $1 million, get $800,000 tax free, and still be able to go to the same grocery store, same dog park, same facilities. You're just moving 5 minutes down the road.
Interesting. Yeah, I was thinking on yet another slog up to see my parents in Richmond Hill. Transit's a whole nother discussion. That I could be convinced by an appeal to the sandwich generation that maybe more purpose senior housing, even in downtown areas, might be great, so that you could, if your parents are open to it, relocate them to be living closer to you. There's also this huge problem with different types of households sort of becoming, I wouldn't say fossilized, in different parts of the GTA, which, going back to some of your environmental and other concerns, I wonder what you've made of that, or whether you've thought a little bit about that.
Yeah, we have, absolutely, and we think that's an issue as well. So we talk a lot at SPI about this idea of drive until you qualify, right? That particularly in the GTA, where you've got a couple who late 20s, early 30s, and they're living in a small condo in downtown Toronto. And baby comes along, or baby's on the way, and they're like, this ain't gonna work, and they drive as far away as they need to go in order to find a home. And oftentimes they're ending up in a community like a Peterborough or a Woodstock. Like, this is not 30 or 40 years ago where they're like ending up in Scarborough or Etobicoke, and they can just hop on a bus and go back. So what this means is very long commutes, but it also often means that they're staying away, or they're having to be far away from parents and other relatives. And I think that's one of the other things that we can talk about in the sort of selfish thing, like, hey, do you want to see your grandkids? Well, then you better be able to build homes in this neighborhood, because otherwise they're moving to Woodstock, and that's like an hour and a half away, and you're gonna see them at the holidays and maybe on FaceTime, and that's it. So it does, have that sort of personal level. It has a big environmental issue with that commute, because many times they're moving to Woodstock, but they still have their job in Mississauga or Toronto. They might not be going in every day, but they might be going in once or twice a week. So they're driving back and forth a lot. But as well, the sort of grandparents who are staying, the seniors who are staying in these neighborhoods, often these neighborhoods are getting old, and the local schools are like half filled. So we're having to bus kids into these schools, or we're having to build schools in new neighborhoods. So you've got like some schools that are brand new and they have more portables in the classrooms, and then you have other schools in older neighborhoods that are like half full. It's just not a great way to use our infrastructure. If we can find ways to get more families into existing neighborhoods where schools already exist, those neighborhoods are already walkable, you wouldn't have to be putting the kids on the bus or driving them to school. It just has better social and environmental outcomes, across the board.
Yes, I mean, that all sounds great. And there's been a few developments, obviously, the allowing of so-called granny flats or units on Toronto properties, so that, maybe a bigger household could be maintained. So it seems like there's progress here and progress there, but realistically, how probable do you think it is that we could build 1.5 million homes in 10 years in Ontario?
Yeah, so we need to make further changes. I mean, we've had the government come in with Bill 23 and a few others, bills, the one that gives mayors more powers. All of that combined is still not going to get us to 1.5. There's not enough. There's not enough there. I think we do have a framework under the task force report. There's a lot in that task force report that still hasn't been adopted. Still hasn't been adopted by the provincial government. One of those is being able to build up to 4 units on a single lot, up to 4 stories. You did that, then that allows for a lot more of those sort of multi-generational households where you can, grandma and grandpa are in one of the homes, the kids are in another, and there's still enough distance that people feel like they have their privacy there, but you're also able to see family members. So I think those things would help, more density along transit lines and things like that. So there's, that is a blueprint to help us get there. I think there's more that we need to do on the non-market side, deeply affordable. There's just parts that the market just isn't going to be able to cater to. It's just, land is too expensive relative to incomes, and you're going to have to find ways to subsidize these things. There's more we can do there. But even if we did both of those things, even if we waved a magic wand and we got all the zoning right, and we started to put more resources into social housing, we also need the people to build the homes, right? So even if you got all the regulatory side right, so there's more that we need to do there. That's partly an immigration thing, but that's also partly a pathway for younger or even older people who want to become a carpenter or an electrician or so on. Those sort of job market pathways. And then finally, one thing I'll add to that as well, I don't think it's realistic, even with all of that, to double the number of homes we build with double the amount of labor. But we build homes basically the same way that my grandfather built homes back in the 40s and 50s. And I could take him to a modern job site and he would be able to figure out what was going on pretty quickly, even though that no other industry works like that. So I think we're going to have to find ways to actually just build properties more productively, new production methods, new materials like mass timber and so on. So we need to look at that side. So there's a whole spectrum of things that we need to do. We're not there yet, but I think we could be. So is this achievable with today's set of policies? No. But if we made some changes, could we conceivably do it? I think we could.
Wow, you're a very hopeful man.
I am hopeful. No, honestly, if I didn't think we could, I'd go off and work on some other problem.
Yeah.
There's a lot of range of stuff we work at the Play Center and SPI, but I actually do like, this is a challenge. But I've spent a lot of my career dealing with climate change, so I'm kind of used to dealing with these large societal changes that seem hopeless at any one point in time. But I am truly optimistic that we can get there. But we do have to make some big changes. I don't think we can avoid that.
Before moving off of supply, you mentioned Bill 23, you mentioned your focus on the environment side of things as well. What do you feel about the Ford government's plan, which seems to insinuate that more of the protected Greenbelt, so the areas that have been set aside and that cannot be developed, are part of the problem? Like, some of this land needs to be opened up.
Yeah, and the short answer, it doesn't. And the Ford's own housing task force that he appointed to study this thing, their report was explicit that we don't need to open up the Greenbelt. It says that in black and white. I think every analyst who's looked at this issue agrees on that. And then furthermore, even by the province's own estimates, this is not getting you millions of extra homes. Even if you believe the province's numbers, this is a few thousand here or there. So no, we don't need this. It's not necessary. There are going to be areas where we do need to sort of expand out land. I do think there are parts of the province, but that doesn't require us to go into environmentally sensitive areas. And in fact, in the long run, it's actually going to reduce the housing supply, because again, these wetlands and protected areas prevent us from flood risk, right? So if we're starting to build homes on floodplains and other areas with a lot of moisture, not only is it bad for the homes you're building there, but it's also bad for the sort of surrounding communities, because there's nowhere for the water to go. And the deep irony about all of this is that a lot of these rules that Bill 23 is getting rid of around conservation authorities were put in place after Hurricane Hazel took out a lot of homes. So there are things to like about Bill 23, but there are some issues as well. And what I would like to see is that this bill that is supposed to be about housing, the best parts of the housing bill are about housing and zoning. Where the bill starts to stray into other areas around, wetlands and around, how much planning authority do regional governments have versus municipal governments have, like things that really aren't really housing issues. I think those, we should set aside. Some of those might be worth looking at in the future, but let's deal with the core issue of how do we get more homes built in our cities.
Is it fair to suggest a little bit cynically that maybe this is an opportunity to tuck in some of those other issues, because we are kind of becoming trained to see housing as this big, big problem? Something must be done. I wonder, is it more financially expedient to just build in Greenbelt area rather than trying to assemble parcels of land and work with other parts of the GTA to intensify development? Like, is it fair to suggest that this is not just a mistake, but rather maybe some people trying to take advantage of a situation?
Well, certainly, like, people are going to profit from this. Absolutely. I mean, you had land that wasn't worth all that much because you couldn't develop on it. Now you're allowed to. So it certainly helps anyone who's been sitting on this land, and that's really who it helps more so than the developers. It's the landowners, right? Because they're ultimately going to get the biggest bang for the buck here. But it does feel, and omnibus bills, this is not the first government to have an omnibus bill, and it won't be the last. It does feel like the government's kind of flooding the zone with like 100 little changes, or, well, not little because they're quite big. And it makes it hard for critics to focus in on any one thing, right? That you've got the conservation authority people are fighting that one at the same time that the people worrying about the powers of regional governments are fighting that one, versus ones that really don't think the mayor, we really need a strong mayor. So it makes it hard to develop a coalition, or makes it hard for people to even understand the problems of this bill when it's so wide ranging. It touches so many things that it doesn't create sort of a central thing to attack. And absolutely, like, I think a lot of this stuff, like particularly the strong mayor side, is just the government wanting this change because they want this change, and then kind of making a hand waving argument about, like, oh well, this is about housing. But it doesn't really seem like, again, let's go to the strong mayors one. It doesn't really seem to affect how, it's not really clear how it affects housing. And in particular, a strong mayor could use their new powers just as easily to block housing as to build new ones. So yeah, I think a lot of it is a bunch of changes that the government wanted to make anyway for other reasons. You throw them in this bill, you do them all at once, and again, it makes it hard for any sort of opposition to coalesce around any one particular issue.
Yeah, and on that Venn diagram between landowners and developers who maybe own land and have been sitting on it for a long time, and who also contribute to political parties, I think newspapers have been quite clear that there obviously are a lot of vested interests here. So that is concerning. Let's move a little bit, even though there's so much more to discuss on supply, a bit over to demand. So our leading analyst at Move Smartly, John Pasalis, who's the president of our parent company, Velocity Realty, is part of a growing group of voices asking us to focus a little bit more on the demand side of the problem, which, perhaps building on the Bank of Canada's recent delightful use of the notorious BIG's famous maxim, more money, more problems, I would describe maybe as more people, more money, more problems. Yeah. So there is more demand through immigration and other sources, but also there is more money involved, more financialization, more parties interested in investing in Canadian real estate. And this is not just financialization by large institutions or the kind of mortgage-backed security chicanery we saw in the US, or institutions buying up homes. This is also happening on a very mom and pop level. John points out that many in the GTA area own a home or a second home as part of their financial portfolio. We're starting to see these second and third houses as we might an RRSP portfolio. So, there is an increase, not only in end users, but a widespread increase in people looking at homes as an investment. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are around that demand side of things.
Yeah, that's absolutely a contributing factor. I mean, no question. And it's like I look at both supply and demand, but you quickly sort of realize that they're kind of interrelated to each other. That basically investors have kind of recognized the lack of supply, and that basically creates the demand, because that lack of supply makes those homes a really good investment, and it allows people to go, okay, well, I kind of see where things are going. I see home prices going up 8, 10, 12% a year in a way that other asset classes aren't. And, sometimes they may believe that it's a safer investment than it really is. Home prices never fall, which we know in 2022 is certainly not true, but, there was that sort of belief out there. So absolutely, I think it makes it makes a bad situation worse. And we see basically where we have shortages, we have more of that activity, right? So and we see that activity in a place like Kitchener-Waterloo. We see a lot of investor activity in a way that we don't in, say, a Winnipeg or a Regina. And it's not because people in Kitchener-Waterloo are inherently more greedy than Winnipeggers, or we're attracting the wrong people in Southern Ontario. It's just a better investment, right? It's just that imbalance between supply and demand is just greater in Ontario than it is in Saskatchewan. So absolutely, and you get these you get these sort of feedback effects, and John has talked about this, that if you have a market where the dynamics should cause the price to go up, prices to go up 7 to 8 to 9% a year, well, what's going to happen is people are going to look at that and go, okay, well, that's going to be really great return, so I want to start investing in these things. And all of a sudden prices start going 15, 20, 25% a year, gets really sort of unsustainable, and then a trigger happens and you fall back to earth. So that's the problem with having these shortages, is it creates these demand cycles, these speculation cycles, where it doesn't just cause prices to be high, but it causes them to be volatile, right? So you see across Southern Ontario, since interest rates went up, prices go down 20 to 40% in some markets, where again in Saskatchewan they barely noticed, right? Like prices had been fairly flat and have stayed fairly flat, and everything's been the province is fairly flat. Everything's been everything's been pretty steady. So absolutely, that lack of supply then creates all of the speculative investor demand. And then we've coupled that over the last few years with sort of record low interest rates, which allow investors to have even greater leverage. And yeah, we're just creating these boom bust cycles. And my fear is that things seem to be returning to earth now, but when interest rates flatten out or start to go down again, are we just setting the seeds for the next speculative bubble? And I'm worried that we are.
So if I can ask a little bit of a more challenging question,
Sure.
Looking at all the issues you've talked about around supply,
Yeah.
and then looking at some of the demand levers that might be changed, immigration's one, around the financialization piece, perhaps taxation or higher taxation on second and third properties owned by individuals or families, it could be a measure. I wonder why we wouldn't start to think about targeting demand side more aggressively, because these are on the face of it an easier thing to change, right? An immigration target or taxes or other policies.
Yeah, and I think we might at some point. So the Green Party of Ontario had a proposal like that, where I think it was like you could have up to 2 homes. You could have a home and a cottage or something like that. But once you went above that, then you would be subject you'd be subject to additional taxation. Now, there's a couple of concerns that the first is that people will just find creative ways around that. So it's like, okay, I'm not buying it, but me and my buddies are starting a numbered corporation, and we're and that's the issue with any sort of tax law, is you create potential ways to go around it. So that's the first one. And the second one is there's concerns that it may actually have the unintended consequence of actually reducing rental supply, right? That people you won't have these things, and you're not replacing them with more purpose-built rental. But I see a role for these things, and I certainly think if the government coupled one of these taxes with some initiatives to build more purpose-built rental, I think it has some upside. And I wouldn't be surprised if the government did so, even not so much as a housing thing, but just as a way to raise revenue kind of thing. Like if the government finds itself in a scenario where it feels like it needs to raise revenue, it's going to go, okay, well, which tax is going to, piss off the fewest number of people and actually make people happy? And it might be that one. They might sort of recognize us as like, okay, if I need to raise $1 billion, am I going to like raise the GST or like sales tax or something like that? Or am I going to do this and go, yeah, we're going after housing speculators? I think, most Ontarians would be like, yeah, go get that $1 billion from housing speculators and leave me out of it. So I wouldn't be surprised if something like this ends up, if not Ontario, someplace else. But yeah, it's got some merit to it.
Yeah, so I think my understanding is that BC used some of the revenues generated by the foreign buyers tax to put into some housing schemes, I think around purpose-built rentals or something. I have to dig into that. So some of these ideas are starting to.
Yeah, and you could absolutely, like, you literally tie the revenue that way as well. So, and we've seen that with vacancy taxes and those kinds of things, where they say, okay, we're gonna take this money, and anything we raise gets earmarked into a housing related fund. So yeah, that's certainly a possibility here.
Yeah, and if we saw a little bit more of that connecting rather than that what we feel cynically as just cash grabs here or there, and then you're not sure where it all goes, I think that would also help what people perceive to be a lack of progress on the housing side. So you've been really generous with your time. I don't want to take up too much more, but I know you teach economics at the university. I'm wondering if you can indulge me in a bit of a student question like thought exercise.
Yeah, absolutely.
So, okay. So if I think back to what I learned in economics, particularly trade economics, we learned about a focus on a particular kind of economy, which has benefit from a certain sector, which then induces particular problems for that economy. So one of the classic cases was the case of oil producing countries. And in the 1950s, I believe case studies and other things are written about an example of the Netherlands, which then had a very oil rich moment of development, and how the power or the attraction of the oil sector by way of attracting people, capital, and everything in the country led to a bit of a distortion. It led away from investment in other sectors. And at various times, because oil is a commodity that can go up and down in price, it left those kind of economies vulnerable. So, it was called the Dutch disease, I believe, then. So, work then started to become more developed around economists thinking about, well, how do we mitigate some of these other factors? Is there a way to manage this kind of growth in a way that's a little bit more cognizant of the downfalls? So thinking about this, I'm wondering if it's time to start thinking about a new kind of economy again. And this one I'm going to call the lifestyle economy. And I think we're seeing this maybe in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and perhaps others, but I'm thinking about a particular set of factors. So one, there are opportunities here to achieve internationally recognized university or post-secondary education. Two, a trusted pathway to permanent residence or citizenship. And three, the prospect of a relatively, and I stress relative, safe healthcare providing community, freedom of from discrimination. I stress relative. Obviously, we are far from perfect. And I think these three factors, and obviously that second one around citizenship, would suggest why America is not necessarily here, because politics can influence what some of those visa programs look like year to year. I wonder if those three factors together result in us selling off not quite our homes, but selling our home land or a concept of home. And I don't think that of this as totally cynical, like, oh, we're just selling off passports. I think this is because Canada has done a lot of things right. In some ways, it is a success. And in many ways, it's a success. And creating these kind of services and goods that people want, education, safety, I mean, these are achievements. So I'm just wondering if maybe Wilfrid Laurier got the century wrong. He thought that the 20th century might be Canada's century. Maybe that century is now, but the success that we are generating is producing distortion. And is there enough? And housing is one of the things, one of the areas that I think our housing sector, is not only distortive in terms of the amount of income that we all have to spend on housing, but the sector itself generates a lot of Canada's GDP. So then, there's a reliance there on housing as it goes up and down, as we're going to see, no doubt, when we start to see job contraction around housing starts and construction shortly, because we're going into a down cycle. So I wonder if what you think of this thought, whether you think there's enough economic thinking or even leadership starting to recognize this as an issue.
Yeah, so I do think there is something to that, and I do, we actually do hear these discussions in Ottawa, and I think we should be clear when we talk about the amount of money going into housing, right? That if the money is actually going towards building things, right? I think that's sort of a beneficial a beneficial thing. Like if we were building big purpose-built rentals the same way we did in the 1960s and 70s, and there's sort of cranes in the sky and all kinds of things. Like I think that if GDP and economic growth is coming from actually creating things, then I think that's a worthwhile thing. And in fact, we probably should be encouraging it more. Where it gets problematic is that portion of housing which isn't about creating something new, is just you and I and everybody else trading the same assets amongst each other, and then taking a cut of that as a fee, and those fees entering into GDP, where we're really not creating much. That's where I think I get concerned, and the fact that so much money goes into that speculative activity, which is money that we could be using not just to build more housing, but to grow our innovative firms, to expand other types of infrastructure, those kinds of things. So absolutely, I do think the amount of money in housing speculation does distort our economy. We need to find ways of dealing with that. But again, I think the best way we can deal with that is to make housing less attractive as a speculative asset. And the best way to do that is to reduce the underlying scarcity issues. That's not the only solution to get there, again. And I think we can look at things like the vacancy taxes and multiple property ownerships, and those kinds of things are worth looking at as well. But I do think we are gonna, that speculation is an issue. And the best way we can get there is to just get rid of these housing shortages and find ways to get more homes built.
Well, I hope you keep on doing this very, very hard work, and hopefully we can start to see a little bit more thinking and leadership on this file, because I don't want to read about Canadian disease,
Yes.
50 years from now.
Yes, no, that sounds terrible.
So
We need a diversified economy that's not just about flipping homes.
Right. So this was a fascinating discussion, Mike. I'm sure we can actually do a part 2 in the future and talk about other issues as they arise. And if you would like to do that, we would be glad to see you again. And otherwise, I just want to thank you for a really great conversation.
Well, thank you. And yeah, let's do this again. I really look forward to it.